Thanks, Sarah, and thanks so much, Kel, as well, for such a brilliant presentation. And I think in addition to just the substance of what you were talking about and the fantastic work you've been doing with ALEX, just also the urgency of this work. And I think for those of us that work with victims and survivors, one of the things we're really conscious of is just the massive chasm and the gap into which this group falls, because we have not developed a service system or a system response to them. And there is a history to that. There's a history to that chasm. Victims and survivors, both children and adults, have been reporting the production of child sexual abuse material since the 70s. If you're unfortunate enough to work with CSAM in any capacity, you'll be aware that online there's digitised child sexual abuse material from the 50s and the 60s. So from the earliest availability of camera technology on the consumer market, sex offenders have been making child sexual abuse material. And there's now quite good historical work looking at some of the pro-pedophile organisations that were campaigning against the age of consent and campaigning for decriminalisation of child abuse in the 70s and the 80s. And in fact, that many of these networks were originally founded around the distribution of child sexual abuse material, including quite strong contacts into Australia. And by and large, I think we've blinded ourselves to the history of the distribution of CSAM in the post-war period, but very significant. The internet has essentially made the level of interest, the extent of the black market in child sexual abuse material undeniable, but it was certainly denied. If we look here in Australia, for example, I grew up in Melbourne, in Victoria. In 1988, the Mornington Daycare Peninsula Preschool was closed by government inquiry in 1988 on the basis that scores of children from that daycare centre disclosed terroristic sexual abuse by the founders. They also reported that they were transported from the daycare centre during the day and images and videos were made of them. In 1992, when that government inquiry reported, it concluded that the daycare centre had been established for the purpose of sexually exploiting those kids. A significant cohort of those kids were referred to the Monash Medical Sexual Assault Unit. And in fact, the social workers and paediatricians were so alarmed by the presentation of those kids and the complexity of their clinical needs and the severity of what they were disclosing, including production of CSAM. They actually held a one-day workshop in 1992, bringing all of the workers together to discuss the treatment of these kids and what they were disclosing. Police declined and prosecutors declined to press charges on the basis that those kids were so young. The alleged offenders who established that daycare centre fled to Queensland. And in 1996, when the internet became commercially available, the former daycare founders published the names and addresses of all of the complainant children online in an act of retaliation against those still very young children for disclosing their experiences in the daycare centre. 2 years after that, what was then the National Crime Authority here in Australia at the Commonwealth level released a report on organised pedophile activity in Australia and somewhat cheerily announced that there was no evidence of systematic child sexual exploitation in Australia. And yet we had cases on the books, investigated, substantiated cases with very strong medical evidence in which the alternative conclusion was certainly available to the NCA. In 1997, you can find sorry to call her out, but Professor Kath Lumby, very well-known media studies academic, published a paper about the cyber porn moral panic and about all of these false claims from law enforcement that the internet would be misused for the distribution of child sexual abuse material. And that we had no reason to build in child protection safeguards into commercial internet service provision because there was no evidence that there was a significant market in child sexual abuse material. In fact, in the United States, the Attorney General in 1986 warned that pedophiles were using what was then called networked computers in order to advertise the availability of child sexual abuse material. The reason why I'm giving you this history is because it's really important. It's really important to understand that we have not come to this point that Kelly has explained, this gap, this chasm, this absence of a response to CSAM victims and survivors. It's not an accident. It's not a coincidence. It's not as though we've only just been told. We've been told for a really long time. And as a country, we've become very effective at doing nothing about it. The sad irony is it took these men taking photos and videos of what they do to children and then distributing it in such prolific numbers. And I believe the NECMEC reports of last year, it's become farcical. I think it was in the order of 90 million suspected CSAM files were reported to the National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children last year. And those figures seem to increase by exponential numbers every year. Interestingly, they've been increasing every year exponentially for about 20 years. And nobody seemed to notice or ring an alarm bell or do all that much about it. So this is an accountability moment, I think, for us to recognise a problem that has surfaced and is only surfacing because we've done a lot of work to keep it buried. The place where it has been surfacing for a long time is survivors. It's when survivors get together. So I first came to this field 20 years ago as a volunteer for Adults Surviving Child Abuse, an organisation who's now the Blue Knot Foundation and one of part of the coalition who established the National Centre for Action in Child Sexual Abuse. So in 2005, we brought a group of survivors together and we just did something very similar to Kel. We just interviewed them and published a report on what they had to say. And a couple of years later, I did my PhD in 2007 and we did the same thing. We brought together a group of 25 survivors. I brought together a group of 25 survivors and just interviewed them about the history of organised child sexual abuse in Australia. Since then, in terms of my career, it's somewhat I think revealing that other than the gracious funding that I received from the Australian Institute of Criminology, my funding for research into child sexual abuse material and child sexual abuse generally comes from overseas. So our funding for Childlight comes from Scotland, of all places. A lot of my research funding for the work I do on CSAM has come from Canada. A minority of it, other than our friends at the AIC, has come from Australia, and that's not from lack of trying. It's not from lack of putting in grant applications and asking for money. The work just doesn't get funded in this country. So when we're talking about the availability, the epidemic availability of CSAM, we need to put it in context. It is about the failure of CSAM removal. We conducted a nationally representative survey of approximately 2,000 men in Australia, and 6.7% of those men said to us that they had intentionally viewed pornography involving people under the age of 18. The work of the AIC, as they've been pulling together data on sex offence charges in Australia, in 22 to 23, 16% of all alleged offenders in this country were charged with a CSAM offence. And as I mentioned earlier, CSAM reporting, so the numbers of CSAM, the amount of CSAM reported to authorities continues to increase exponentially. And it is not simply because we're getting better at detecting CSAM, although we are, but as we get better at reporting CSAM, offenders seem to get much better at distributing it. Because in 20 years, we have yet to see a reduction in those numbers. Those numbers go up year on year on year. And there's a couple of reasons for this, including the foundational legal order of the internet. Some of you will be familiar with Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996. If you don't know it, it's because it's American legislation. It was passed in the US really to provide the legal foundation for what was then the burgeoning technology sector. What Section 230 does is it provides criminal and civil immunity for internet service providers for third-party content. So if I distribute illegal content on Twitter, for example, then Elon Musk is not personally sued, although, boy, wouldn't that be enjoyable. But I'm held liable. Okay, Elon Musk is not held liable. But what this means actually is that internet service providers have no legal obligation for the detection and removal of illegal content, including CSAM. By and large, this very laissez-faire regulatory posture has been adopted by the Australian government until the establishment of the E-Safety Commission, and also in the UK and in Europe. And we're now seeing governments trying to put the horse back in the stable after it's bolted, trying to figure out how do we start to regulate an online environment that whereupon governments and the private sector were very much in lockstep for the first 20 years of its development. The global system for the removal of CSAM has just developed in a really ad hoc fashion, in different ways, in different countries, but what we can say is that it is not enough. We can say this, I think, pretty definitively. Very few online services have implemented any measures that would scan for CSAM. What that means is that if we look at the NECMEC figures, so 90 million files reported last year of suspected CSAM, the overwhelming majority of that material is known. It's hashed. It's already been identified and detected. What it means is that CSAM goes up onto an internet service provider. If it is reported or detected, it goes down and it goes back up a minute later, and there is nothing to stop it. And we are talking about files that have been in existence and going through this cycle for perpetuity. And we can think about the law enforcement officers that are exposed to this. We can think about the civil providers who are doing online safety content moderation, who are being exposed to this content over and over and over and over again. And yet for those of us who advocate for proactive CSAM blocking, because we think that illegal content should be blocked at the point of upload, it shouldn't go onto a hosting provider where it's distributed before somebody notices that it's there and takes it down, we get accused of an attack on civil liberties at a massive scale. Now, even where as we're sort of seeing, I think, some global movements towards increased proactive response, we have jurisdictions that provide for bulletproof hosting. So we have jurisdictions that will allow internet service provision to stand up, to host and cache illegal content. Those jurisdictions have lax law enforcement and regulatory provisions. And in that case, there's often very little that we can do or that can be done. Kell has really hammered home the point that CSAM constitutes a distinct and ongoing harm to victims and survivors, and I cannot emphasise how concrete this is. The Phoenix 11 are a group of young women in North America that myself and the Canadian Centre for Child Protection and other advocates, particularly in North America, have supported to stand up over the last 5 or 6 years. They are called the Phoenix 11. They are anonymous. They cannot show their faces. We cannot tell you their names because they are not safe. Now, that's an interesting distinction. If we look at image-based abuse of women, for example, there was public victim advocacy from 2009 onwards. Now, it is still extremely humiliating and shaming and dangerous to be an adult victim of image-based abuse. It is even more risky to be a child victim. And that is why we do not have public advocates who stand up, very rare, and say, I am a CSAM survivor. Because we are talking about organised communities, numbering in their millions, hosted primarily on Tor hidden services, not to mention on Telegram, not to mention on Signal, who look to find information of these kids, now adults, and they will hunt them down. And I'll show you examples of this in a moment. So the Phoenix 11 make the point that this debate about online regulation and online safety, it has not attended to CSAM survivors because it's been extremely difficult for CSAM survivors to represent their own experience. So they say you haven't heard survivors' voices in this public debate. We have to be diligent about protecting our identities. No one has protected us. We have been stalked, we have been doxxed, we have been hunted. Every day we fear someone who has seen our abuse material will recognise us. So for C3P, they conducted a survey of 150 adult survivors of CSAM. Fully 1/3 reported being harassed or terrorised in some respects by CSAM consumers as an adult. That can include physical attack, it can include blackmail, and so on. So in the absence of proactive methods to detect and remove CSAM, there's basically one group who's very active in looking for CSAM. Well, there's two. Okay, one of them is pedophiles. The other one is law enforcement. Okay, there's a third group, which is survivors. Because if they want their content down, if they want it removed, they have to find it and they have to request removal. And we have a cohort of survivors that are doing exactly that. And I've personally done work with a CSAM survivor who attempted suicide because of her exposure to CSAM, because she was trying to find her own material for removal, because she was really concerned about her safety and the safety of her child. So you're really getting a picture. Again, I talked about a chasm. Yeah? I talked about a gap. I think sometimes working in this space, it's like there's no oxygen in the room. You know, you really have to put on a spacesuit to survive, because it's astonishing to think that this situation has been allowed to persist for such a long time. So in terms of my work with CSAM survivors, there's a number of really common challenges. So firstly, CSAM is typically part of a polyvictimisation context. They've not only experienced child sexual abuse, they've frequently experienced a range of other harms, and particularly for survivors where the content was produced when they were quite young, that's predominantly produced in a family context. So if CSAM's being produced in a family context, you can imagine there's a couple of other adverse childhood experiences that they're being exposed to. The point was made earlier, the majority of kids in CSAM are actually not known to the authorities. And so what that means is we have a significant cohort of CSAM victims growing up without protective intervention. Some are highly traded, but many have ongoing concerns about distribution. And Kel sort of talked about the messages that we inadvertently deliver to survivors in terms of the way that we talked about CSAM. The fact is actually most CSAM, particularly more recent CSAM, is not widely distributed. When we look at the highly traded series, they were often produced from the late 90s to kind of the late noughties. There's sort of a 10-year period where producers are creating content, but they have very bad OPSEC, and they haven't realised that CSAM can go viral. And when CSAM goes viral on the dark net or on the clear web or on an encrypted service, it's a very good way to get caught if you're a producer, basically. So producers are much more locked down now than they used to be, but survivors don't know that. Survivors often think if images or videos have been made of me, it must be everywhere. It must be all over the dark web, right? Very significant mental health implications. I've just finished 3 years as the president of the International Society for the Study of Trauma and Dissociation. We are a network of 2,000 predominantly mental health workers around the world, and the majority of our members are working with CSAM survivors. So longer-term chronic illness, longer-term disability, very limited capability in the Australian health system to provide support to survivors of child sexual abuse, full stop, let alone CSAM survivors. I'll also say the majority of therapists have no training in tech-facilitated abuse, so they just don't understand the nature of this work. Distribution has safety implications for survivors. It has implications for their families. Outside of the United States, there's really no tailored criminal or civil justice response to CSAM victims. So the US has a particular framework around an opt-in notification system, for example, mandatory compensation and restitution amounts. And that's really been done by some campaigning civil litigators in the US. We have no equivalent approach in Australia. No proactive removal mechanisms, and we also have issues with the way in which CSAM is removed globally. At the moment, the content that's prioritised is called the worst of the worst, so that's a rape of a prepubescent child. If CSAM does not meet that baseline, then it may well not be prioritised for removal. And what that means is that we can have 13, 14 or 15-year-old girls whose offenders are in prison for the production of CSAM, but their content's quite widely distributed, and you can find it on adult pornography sites, you can find it embedded in sort of adult pornography, sort of picture collections, so on and so forth. It's a real nightmare for those girls because their faces are very visible, and you know, if you're abused at 7, you look quite different at 21. If you're abused at 14, you look pretty pretty similar at 21. So I'm going to take you through the Jane Doe project. This is a collaboration with the Canadian Centre for Child Protection, the Jane and John Doe project. And really the aim of this project is to identify highly traded series of known victims and survivors, to look at the extent of the failure to remove CSAM and the implications for victims and survivors. What we're doing here with the Jane Doe project, I've got an article under review on this at the moment, is trying to promote a new data paradigm that places survivors at the centre of CSAM data collection and analysis, rather than saying, well, we've got this offender and he has this number of videos and this number of images. Well, how many children were in the images and videos that he collected, for example? So a partnership with C3P, we extracted data from Product Arachnid. We also looked at offender conversations on Talk Hidden Services. If you're not familiar with Arachnid, the most effective CSAM removal system in the world, as it goes through the process of CSAM removal, it also provides very important data on the distribution of individual series. So this is, I'm going to present to you now three Australian series. These are Australian kids. This is John Doe, and so this is an image-based series. It was produced and prosecuted in the early 2000s here in Australia. It depicts the exploitation and assault. It's a group of prepubescent boys, but it's focused on one boy in particular. The series has been in distribution for over 15 years. Distribution points for John Doe detected almost 3,000 times by Arachnid in the last 5 years. Distribution points just mean that there was a download link. It could be a link to one file. It could be a link to an archive of 100 files. And we don't know how many people clicked that link. Okay? So we are not getting a sense of the full extent of distribution here. Very active offender discussion on Talk Hidden Services. So offenders know a little bit about this series. Anyone know the backstory of the Australian boys? So they know that they're Australian. Multiple offenders actually claim that they had background knowledge of the offender. You don't always know if they're telling the truth. There's a lot of kind of braggadocio on Talk Hidden Services. But, you know, the man's name was this, which is true. He ended up getting this number of years, which is true. He should be out now, assuming no charges were brought against him. So they have accurately connected the offender to the series. Offender discussion indicates that actually the victims may have been identified by the offender community. So the kid's in his school uniform, which is not uncommon in CSAM, and an offender says, well, I actually know what school he went to, which means he knows the town, he knows the location. And another claimed direct contact with the victim. So I used to chat with John Doe's adult friend all the time on an offender forum, sometimes even the victim himself. I even got a call from them one time or two. I think a key point to take away here as well is that this series is more available now than it ever was. Yeah. So Jane Doe, image and video-based series, very extreme sexual violence committed by a father against his daughter over a really long period of time. It's been in circulation for over 10 years, very popular series, cited almost 5,000 times. They know that the series is Australian, but other than that, they don't know much else about it. To go to Kel's point about the accurate use of databases, so the victim rescued herself. Okay, nobody rescued this kid. She disclosed what her dad was doing at 15. It was reported to law enforcement and the dad was charged and imprisoned. But because the series wasn't solved through law enforcement, nobody notified ICSA. And because nobody notified ICSA, law enforcement has been looking for this girl in Australia for 10 years. Yeah. So there's been an active attempt to find this kid for 10 years. You know, she put her dad in prison. And we can sort of think about police officers wasting their time, being exposed to this really egregious content over a long period of time because, simply put, this wasn't logged accurately in the database. This is a really upsetting one. I mean, this is all pretty upsetting. Jane Doe, so video-based series. It's a capping series. So she was, at the age of 9, she was lured onto a live streaming platform and she was sexually exploited on that platform. Not highly distributed. However, her name is known to the offender community and widely circulated on it. She actually died as a teenager. She was hit by a car. Offenders have shared her legal name. They've shared newspaper articles about her death. They also shared a fundraising page for her funeral. Her family members are easily identifiable, including at the time her minor siblings. So her death is very well known to the offender community, but they continue to share the material alongside commentary such as, "Very sad, I shall light a candle as I masturbate to her tonight." Yeah. So this also gives you a really good sense of the sorts of cultures that are being engendered on Tor hidden services. If you in any way try and contest the social utility of encryption, you'll be told it's a vital human rights instrument and that democracy itself hinges on the existence of Tor hidden services. All of our evidence says that the majority of the use of Tor is for illegal activity, primarily child abuse material, and we are talking about, I think, 3 million active users over the 10 most popular sites at the moment. So we have constituted an online country of child sex offenders, and this is the sort of thing that they discuss. At Childlight, we're doing some work looking at service mapping for CSAM victims and survivors. Kel made the point that there's no organisation at the moment in Australia who supports CSAM survivors. That is absolutely right. The question is what should be the nature of that support? It's also the case that even if we start to look at mainstream child abuse and sexual assault services, actually their capacity, their training to do this work is quite limited. So we're currently doing some pilot work around what outreach to CSAM survivors would look like, what service provision would look like. So this was frankly just a small sort of seat of the pants research project looking at service provision for CSAM and also sexual extortion. So 124 people participated in the survey. I'm just going to take you through the picture that we got. And so 37% of people came from a sexual assault service. We had 28% from a service that included support around sexual violence. We had 14% a healthcare service that had integrated sexual assault support, and then other, which might be education, community legal services. So we asked, 88 people responded to a question, how many clients have you had disclosed CSAM victimisation? So under 15% said none, a third said 1 to 2, a quarter said 3 to 4, under 10% said 5 to 6, and then over 15% said more than 6. So what you're seeing is that the majority of people that responded to this survey who work in a sexual assault service or a sexual assault or child abuse context, the majority have had a CSAM client. We asked them, how prepared do you feel to support CSAM clients? Only 20% said that they were very prepared, that they felt very prepared to do that work. We asked about online child sexual extortion. What we had was about a third said none, and 2/3 said that they had had at least one client. Overall, their sense of preparedness to do this work was less than their sense of preparedness for CSAM, which is fairly alarming. I mean, again, it's all pretty alarming, but particularly with the rapid escalation of online sexual extortion over the last 5 years, the fact that our frontline service providers have not been provided with the training to do this work. I think it also gives you a sense of the view that child sexual abuse is static, that if you've received training on child sexual abuse 10 or 20 years ago, you're probably good to go. That's not the case. Okay? Child sexual abuse changes. And offenders change, particularly in the online environment. Things are changing quite rapidly in terms of the pattern of online offending, particularly against kids. And as offenders network online, they're also sharing strategies. Yeah. We asked about the type of service provision for CSAM and sexual extortion. So bear in mind that we had about 1 in 5 people saying, I feel very prepared to work with CSAM clients. But predominantly what they're providing is child sexual abuse related counselling and trauma therapy. That's primarily their sense of preparedness. When it comes to the tech facilitated issue, they talked about referring to police, referring to eSafety, or referring to ACE. They had minimal to no specific resources on CSAM and sexual extortion, either to provide to clients, and they had nothing on their websites. When we publish this, we'll publish a website audit. It was very rare to non-existent that there was any outreach to CSAM survivors. And this is also true for our friends at eSafety. Yeah? When we look at the spectrum of CSAM victimisation, really no services in Australia are seeking to speak to and providing outreach to this group. There is no tailored model of care, support and safety planning for this population. Trauma therapy is great. It's great. It's really important. I'm the former president of a trauma therapy organisation. I think it's important. What about safety planning? Yeah. What about genuine concerns that your content is still being shared, and who's checking to make sure that you're okay online if it's not you? When we said to them, but what would you like? Lots of ideas. They wanted specialised, accredited, advanced training on technology-facilitated child sexual abuse. They wanted access to expert consultation. They wanted better collaboration and connection with specialist agencies, tailored therapeutic resources for victims and their caregivers, the creation of specific intervention tools and therapeutic materials. They wanted financial support so that they could move from a crisis intervention to this group to longer-term support. They wanted strengthened networks and partnerships with law enforcement and child protection agencies, joint training opportunities, access to educational materials and tools, and they wanted improved referral pathways. They wanted to know how to work better with police and how to work better with eSafety. So in summary, CSAM survivors have been with us for a very long time, and they are not going away, and their numbers are getting larger. They require a tailored and multi-sectoral response. Our research shows known Australian survivors and their families are exposed on tall hidden services, but Australian policy and practice responses to CSAM are fragmented and uncoordinated. There is no Australian notification, compensation or restitution scheme for CSAM. Australian sexual assault and child abuse services are providing general trauma counselling to this group, and professionals who work with child abuse victims and survivors are signalling a level of preparedness to support this group, but there is clear interest and willingness, and I think a sense of urgency to build capability right across the response system. Thank you.